So, picture this. You've got a neighbor, not just any neighbor, but the kind you wave to every morning. The one whose lawnmower you borrow and whose barbecue you crash every summer. You've lived next to them forever. You know their routines, their quirks, and even the way they shovel their driveway in winter. You borrow sugar, you watch their cat, you even pretend to like their weird garden gnomes. It's a relationship built on small favors and mutual respect, the kind that feels unbreakable. That's been Canada and the United States for, like, a century. The world's longest undefended friendship. Two countries side by side sharing more than just a border. But then, your neighbor installs a blaring orange-hued security system and starts accusing your cat of plotting against him. Suddenly the trust is gone, replaced by suspicion and noise. That's basically what happened in early 2025. The year started with a jolt, and the headlines were impossible to ignore. President Donald Trump, back in the White House, decided the friendly northern border was a problem. He called for new rules, new barriers, and a new attitude. He threatened a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Suddenly, maple syrup and cars got a lot more expensive. The things Canadians took for granted were now luxury items overnight. But it wasn't just about money. Trump mused that maybe Canada should just become the 51st state. The idea was tossed out with a smirk, but it landed like a punch. Telling Canadians to become Americans? That's like telling a cat to bark. It's not just impossible, it's unthinkable. It was more than a political spat, it was a direct poke at Canadian identity. For many, it felt like an insult to everything that made them proud to be Canadian. By March, the tariffs hit. 25% on steel, aluminum, and cars. Factories braced for layoffs and workers worried about their futures. Then, a blanket 10% Liberation Day tariff on everything else. Groceries, electronics, even hockey sticks, nothing was spared. Liberation from what? Maybe just from reasonably priced goods. Canadians started to feel the pinch every time they opened their wallets. The final straw? Canadians woke up to find Google Maps had renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. It was a digital slap in the face, a petty move that made headlines everywhere. It was petty, it was strange, and for many Canadians, it was the last straw. The mood shifted from disbelief to anger, and conversations at kitchen tables turned serious. The friendly wave was replaced with a middle finger. The old warmth at the border crossings was gone, replaced by a new chill. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore, it was an attack on Canadian pride. People who'd never marched before were suddenly waving flags in the streets. Canadians, usually mild-mannered, found a collective voice. Community halls filled up and social media buzzed with calls for action. If the US was going to treat them like an adversary, they'd respond, not with tanks, but with their wallets. The message was clear: support local, stand together. The Great Canadian Boycott was about to begin, and it was going to be bigger than anyone expected. It wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. The spark had been lit. Now the fire was spreading. What started as frustration was turning into a nationwide stand. Canadians were ready to fight back in the most Canadian way possible, by shopping elsewhere. Every purchase became a statement, every receipt a small act of defiance. The world was about to see what happens when you push your polite neighbor too far. The quiet ones were now making the most noise. And this time, the gloves were off. Canada was ready to show just how strong its spirit could be. Canadians didn't riot, they rebelled in the aisles of supermarkets and drive-thrus. Instead of taking to the streets, they took to their shopping carts, quietly but powerfully making their voices heard through what they chose to buy or not buy. Suddenly, American brands became symbols of the conflict. The familiar logos that once blended into the background now stood out as reminders of a larger struggle. That morning coffee, that burger, that fizzy drink, they all became political choices. Every sip and every bite was a statement, a small act of protest or solidarity, and Canadians started choosing Canada. They reached for products with maple leaves, supporting their own farmers, bakers, and makers. A study showed a jaw-dropping decline in the popularity of major US brands. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Kraft Heinz, Pizza Hut, all took a hit. Their once busy locations grew quieter as Canadians walked past. Nearly 70% of the 75 biggest US brands in Canada saw their favorability plummet. The numbers told a story of shifting loyalties and changing habits. Amazon felt the chill too, as Canadians flocked to local e-commerce sites. Even online, the movement gained momentum. With shoppers seeking out homegrown alternatives, people were willing to wait longer for packages if it meant supporting Canadian businesses. Patience became a badge of honor in this new consumer landscape. This wasn't a trend, it became a new way of life. Shopping was no longer just about convenience. It was about values and identity. Families discussed where their food came from. Dinner tables became places for conversations about supporting local and making a difference. Shoppers squinted for "Made in Canada" labels. Every purchase was scrutinized, every label checked twice. The boycott turned every citizen into a quiet economic soldier. Each trip to the store became a mission. Each decision a small act of resistance. The real power wasn't in politicians' hands, it was in millions of small, deliberate choices. Ordinary people, united by purpose, were making a real impact. And those choices were adding up fast, reshaping the marketplace and sending a message that could not be ignored. Tea's one thing when people stop buying American bourbon. It's another when the government stopped stocking it. Provincial governments jumped in, turning the boycott into official policy. Ontario's LCBO pulled US-made bourbon and wines from shelves. Jim Beam and Jack Daniels vanished overnight. British Columbia and New Brunswick followed, creating a domino effect. The provinces used their purchasing power as a weapon, but it didn't stop with booze. Ontario canceled a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink, choosing to build its own rural internet. Elon Musk, a Trump donor, was told his services were no longer welcome. This sent shockwaves through the tech industry. The boycott now had government backing and real economic teeth. By targeting high-profile American industries, the provinces showed Canada had leverage and wasn't afraid to use it. The message was clear: Canada was done playing nice. The boycott was now a coordinated, multi-level resistance, and American companies were feeling the heat. The trade war turned the digital world into a new battleground. Canadians started seeing their devices as portals for American influence. Sending data and money to US companies suddenly felt wrong. The great Canadian tech exodus began. People ditched Gmail for Northmail, Google search for Switch, homegrown alternatives surged. The movement was about economic retaliation and data sovereignty. If the US president could get Google to rename a Gulf, what else could they do? There were even calls to revive BlackBerry as a symbol of independence. The idea of a Silicon Prairie didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. This digital patriotism was about building something Canadian from the ground up. The Canadian tech boycott challenged the global dominance of Silicon Valley. In a trade war, even your search engine becomes political. Canada and the US were neighbors by geography, friends by choice. But 2025 changed everything. The US went from reliable ally to unpredictable bully. Polls showed US favorability among Canadians dropped sharply after Trump's re-election, and plummeted with the tariffs. The image of America as a friendly partner was replaced by one of aggression and self-interest. Trust evaporated. Everyday life reflected the change. Conversations, sporting events, even the national anthem. This wasn't just about policy, it was a deep emotional rift. Tariffs can be lifted, but trust is harder to rebuild. Canadians now see the US as a problem to manage, not a partner. The world's longest undefended border now has an emotional wall. When Canada gives you the cold shoulder, you feel it, especially if you're an American business giant. The relationship between these two neighbors has always been close, but when tensions rise, the impact is immediate and unmistakable. The boycott inflicted real economic pain. Goldman Sachs estimated an $83 billion hit to the US economy in 2025. That's not just a number, it's a shockwave felt in boardrooms and on factory floors across the country. Tesla, closely tied to Elon Musk and Trump, became a prime target. The company's image, once futuristic and bold, suddenly became a symbol of controversy. Its share price tumbled 40%, global sales dropped, and the chill spread to Europe. Investors and employees alike watched anxiously as the fallout grew. Other brands like McDonald's and Coca-Cola saw millions in lost revenue. Their familiar logos couldn't shield them from the backlash. Suntory Holdings, owner of Jim Beam, expected lower sales due to anti-US sentiment. Even global companies with American roots felt the sting. The boycott made Made in USA a liability. Shoppers who once sought out American goods now hesitated or looked elsewhere. Political decisions in Washington had immediate impacts on companies and workers across America. The ripple effects were impossible to ignore. The Canadian boycott became a case study in consumer activism as a geopolitical force. It showed how everyday choices can shape international relations. American businesses were caught in the crossfire, paying the price for their government's policies. For many, the consequences were deeply personal. A strong brand isn't enough when your country is picking fights with its best customers. Reputation alone can't overcome political fallout. The chill from the north was real and costly. It was a wake-up call for American companies, forcing them to rethink their global strategies. The lesson: never underestimate your neighbor. In a global economy, even the closest allies can become powerful adversaries overnight. The boycott wasn't just angry tweets, it was organized, tech-savvy, and smart. Canadians built apps like Buy Beaver and MapleScan to scan barcodes and spot American products instantly. MapleScan rocketed up the app charts, making the boycott easier than ever. Online resources listed Canadian alternatives for everything from ketchup to tech. This digital infrastructure turned shopping into a strategic act of defiance. The movement was mobilized by programmers and entrepreneurs, not politicians. It created a sense of community and collective action. Modern protests aren't just in the streets, they're in your pocket. The Buy Canadian movement proved that information is power, and a barcode scan can be revolutionary. Canada wasn't alone. America First policies sparked backlash worldwide. The Canadian boycott became a blueprint for Europe, where frustration with US policy was boiling over. In Germany, 64% said they'd avoid American products. Social media groups for boycotting US goods exploded across Europe. Businesses like Denmark's Salling Group started tagging European-made products to help consumers choose local. The line between commerce and politics blurred everywhere. The US was now alienating its biggest trading partners. The boycott showed a united front of consumer resistance. America's soft power, its brands and culture, was being damaged by its hard power tactics. The world was sending a clear message: respect us or we'll shop elsewhere. The Great Canadian Boycott redrew the economic and emotional map of North America. The special relationship is over. A new era of caution and confrontation has begun. For American businesses, the damage may take years to repair. They'll need to rethink global strategies and brand identities. For Canada, this is a chance to build a stronger, more self-reliant economy. The Buy Canadian movement has created a captive audience for homegrown products. This is a story about respect. Smaller nations have power and pride. The friendly border now has an invisible wall of consumer defiance. The road ahead will require more than trade deals. It will require rebuilding trust. And as any good neighbor knows, trust can't be bought or bullied, it has to be earned.